Welcome to Whitewater Leadership. My name is George Hutchinson and I'm Chief Exec and founder of River EFRA. River EFRA is a crisis and reputational risk advisory firm, and I've spent the best part of the last 30 years advising business leaders and leaders of organisations and charities when they're facing into major risks and systemic threats and crises. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Polly Neate. Polly.
Thanks, George. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the podcast. I'm Polly Neate. I'm an expert advisor for River EFRA, and I also convene the Social Insights panel for the Future Governance Forum. I'm really excited to be co-hosting this series of podcasts which look at what I think are some of the most significant challenges facing leaders in any sector, as George said. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the wisdom of some of the most well-respected leaders in the charity sector. As a former chief executive myself of Shelter and Women's Aid, I've definitely had my share of some Whitewater experiences in my time.
Our guest for this episode is Hugh Thornbery. Hugh has chaired 3 charities, been a non-executive director of a housing association and chief executive of Adoption UK. Hugh, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for coming. Full disclosure, Hugh's also my husband. I think we should get that out there into the open.
Excellent. So hopefully you know each other quite well.
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. So Hugh, before we get into the detail of today's discussion, I guess River EFRA is a reputational risk and crisis management organisation, and we've been thinking about essentially kind of the acute crises facing the charitable sector. Yeah. And I guess particularly how that affects the trustees and the governance of charities. And within that space, if you think about the management of risk, what does good look like for a charity?
I think good has to look very good these days. I think the times that we're operating in, I joined the charity sector as an employee in 1993. I had 19 years of trustee experience with charities. And over that time, things have become more and more complicated. There's a complexity within the sector, there's a complexity within the outside world. So I think trustees have to raise their game. I think the passivity that many trustees used to comfortably sit within on charity boards, leaving it to the executive to get on with it, is something that we perhaps move on from. I think the challenge within that, though, is finding the right people who are prepared to give up an increasing amount of their own time without any monetary reward to manage risk effectively within charities.
You talked about the passivity trustees have sometimes had in relation to the exec and letting the exec get on with it. But that is a boundary that's quite difficult to negotiate, isn't it? When do you step in as a chair particularly, but as a board, and when do you leave it to the exec? And in reputation risk, how have you managed to strike that balance?
The last thing I'm advocating is that trustees step in and roll their sleeves up and tread on the toes of the executive. And we might say more about that sort of later on within this conversation. What I'm talking about is that active seeking of assurance and ensuring the right arrangements are in place to enable you, without sort of going down onto the work floor all the time, to understand exactly what's going on and contextualize that, what's happening in the organisation with what's going on elsewhere. And if there's that sort of disconnect in any part of the sort of set of relationships, that's where reputation risk is at its highest, I think. So it's not about doing the executive's job, it's ensuring the executive are doing their job well and having the right mechanisms to be able to not only support that, but to assure oneself that the things they say are happening in the right way.
Because you've used their assurance as a real key word. A lot of boards that I've worked to have come from a place of we're here to support and challenge. And I think that can cause some problems. I'm interested to know what you think about that.
Well, that's the shorthand I used to use. If I was recruiting trustees, I'd be saying to them, there's a role here of supporting, but also challenging. I've moved on from that completely. What's helped me move on and think about this in a different way is being a non-executive director of a housing association. And I think there's some really interesting sort of comparisons between how housing association boards operate and how charity boards have traditionally operated. And you won't hear the words support and challenge on a housing association board. You're far more likely to hear, we need assurance that this is working. And sometimes that assurance is sought through bringing in third parties to double check things. So you're triangulating rather than just getting your information from one source.
And if you go back a little bit, and certainly a little, some of our experience has been that, trustees, I think when they join charities, they're doing it partly because they want to support a mission-led, purpose-led organisation. They want to really be there and kind of, I guess, feel good about themselves. And then sometimes when the challenges and the risks emerge, we've seen them kind of step back a little bit and step away from feeling as though they had a real responsibility to tackle the problem, because that wasn't the reason they got there in the first place. Is that a fair challenge, do you think?
I think it's a fair challenge, and that goes back to my earlier point about, I think, how trustee boards and individuals on those boards need to be operating in a different way to the way in which they used to operate. And that's quite hard to ask of volunteers, I think. And clearly, everybody who's on that board should absolutely be passionate about the cause. That's why they should be there. They should be bringing skills and knowledge and experience that are going to help the delivery of the strategy of the organisation. But I've seen it both as a chief executive and as a chair, where things have got really difficult. Some people are there doing the right things. Others are creating havoc in terms of the panic that comes from their own then fear of something going wrong on their watch, what it might mean for their own personal reputation, so on.
And that personal reputation, I think, coming into that place, it's very difficult to separate the personal these days from the professional. In fact, in social media worlds, it just, the two absolutely overlap these days. And so a perceived wrong or harm by the charity you might be a trustee of, you end up owning. How do you, in that polarized world, how do you have any kind of ability to actually look at it and make a judgment about what's going on rather than just reacting?
I think the chair has a key role to play within that. And I think that in difficult times where perhaps you are facing significant reputation risk or some other problem, to have the chair and the chief exec working in consort, based on mutual trust, as a key part of the equation, because the chief executive needs to manage their team through a difficult time. Chair needs to be helping the chief executive do that, but the chair also needs to be managing the board. And I think where things can go wrong is where chairs don't demonstrate the leadership that I believe they need to demonstrate. And it's a difficult role to chair, because if you look at the sort of charity commission stuff, it's sort of first among equals, whose job is to enable the group of trustees to reach a consensus. Well, we're in a crisis. It's very hard to reach a consensus about the way forward. I think chairs in those situations need to step up and be able to sort of not only manage the chief exec and what's going on there, but manage their own team of people. And that's not easy. And I think within that, as chair, and I've experienced very difficult situations as chair, you just have to, park your ego, and resist the temptation to become stressed yourself, and just think about, well, what's important here is not my reputation or the reputation of the trustees, it's the long-term success and reputation of the charity.
And I think that point's a really important piece. We think about risk and crisis when you're in the heat of it as needing sort of three things. So most organisations have only ever really thought about their plans and processes. But actually, when you're in the heat of the crisis, it's the decisions you take and how you take them and how quickly you can take them in an alien landscape where everybody wants you to make decisions instantly, and maybe you have to, but also the behaviours that sit behind that. And I guess there's a real place then for a chair to try and actually enable the leadership to come to the best possible decisions and to behave in the right way, rather than applying in a way their own ego to the situation that may make it worse.
Or completely. And I think there's a danger, and again, I've seen this from both sides, of when things are getting very difficult and challenging and risky, the temptation of the board to step down in either a well-intentioned, I'm going to be helpful way.
So stepping down to roll your sleeves up and get involved, is that?
Yeah, and start, crossing that boundary that Polly was talking about earlier of where the sort of trustee executive boundary should be. And so I think that's the sort of temptation. So maybe well sort of intentioned, or it might be less well intentioned, and actually we don't trust our executive. Well, if you don't trust the executive, you should have done something about that before the crisis occurred, then maybe the crisis wouldn't have occurred. It's more important to step back and be thinking about the much, much bigger picture, because the executive can't do that because they're in the day-to-day crisis. We need to be making decisions that are managing the here and now of the crisis, but also with that that understanding of the sort of the bigger picture and where this organization sits, where it's going to sit in the future. I mean, most organizations will go through difficult times and they will recover as long as it's managed well.
There's a real issue at the moment in the sector of it being really, really difficult to recruit chairs to charities. A lot of charities are really struggling with that. And I think what you were talking about the really difficult judgment calls that chairs need to make and that leadership role, you're kind of in a leadership sandwich between the exec and the board. There's got to be something to do with why people just are not that interested in the role anymore. The personal risk doesn't feel worth it. What do you think the sector can do to get over that? Because we've got to have chairs, right? Charities have to have chairs.
They do, and I think it's different. I don't think there's any sort of easy answer to that. I think the Charity Commission has a role to play. I don't think the Charity Commission serves us well at all as a sector. I don't think it's demonstrating the leadership. I think much of what it says is undermining the sector and making it harder to recruit good people into the sector. There's an over focus on executive pay and income cost ratio and things like that. So I think there's something that could be done there in terms of national regulatory leadership. And if it were better resourced, it could be doing things that would be supporting. So again, using my housing association analogy, when the housing association I was on the board of was getting into some difficulties, it self-disclosed to the regulator far earlier than any charity would have self-disclosed to the Charity Commission. And nice people turn up and they help you and they guide you towards how, and they bring some other people in to help you. Now, if then you don't respond to that help, or you can't respond to that help, some slightly less nice people turn up. But it's a very active engagement motivated by this needs to be absolutely perfect for the tenants. So we're going to throw regulatory support and, if necessary, intervention to ensure that the tenants of this association continue to have the best quality homes. There's nothing like that, I don't think, within the charity sector. So I think that's one issue. There's an issue about should you pay trustees? Now, the majority of charities are very, very small organisations, most of them without paid staff. So your trustees are the people who are delivering the service. And then there's other huge organisations on the front line of delivering services that used to be delivered by the state. And there's such a difference between those organisations. If you're going to pay people, I don't think you're going to pay people down at that sort of smaller end, but where do you draw some lines? I'm not sure paying people, I mean, the amount of money I was paid to be an executive director of the Housing Association was a very low amount of money. And they expected an awful lot of me for that. But in a way, some sort of recognition of that I was putting sort of time into that I could have been doing something else with. So I'm not sure there's an easy answer in relation to that. But I think people hear messages about charities, and that is not, that come through the media from elsewhere, that I don't think necessarily are promoting charity leadership to be a great place to be.
And I don't want to actually pick on the regulator, because actually I think at the moment most regulators are under an awful lot of pressure to think about how do they make sure that from I guess almost a purely compliance basis, there are no surprises and no problems, rather than they are there to enable a very healthy, thriving sector, no matter what it is.
If the Charity Commission doesn't have the resources to do what I'm suggesting it should be doing, so its hands are tied.
And therefore, how do you start to kind of navigate a different and new world where at the moment I do think lots of the chief execs and leadership that we come across feel just policed
Yeah.
and trying not to be caught out by their regulator rather than enabled and supported. And actually that creates hostile relationships on both sides. And if you think you're going to have a fight, when you meet each other, generally speaking, the behaviours aren't ideal.
No, that's right. There's not that sort of trusting partnership there, is there? And I think it's not just about the regulator. I think there's a set of systemic issues that are driving charitable organisations to be doing things that increase their risks. And there's a short-termism that comes with contracting. Yep. There's the pressure from funders, from commissioners, and from the general public, as well as from the Charity Commission, in terms of your overheads. If you drive your overheads down, you start losing all those things that are assuring your safeguarding's good. You can understand what's going on, you understand what impact you're having, and so on. So I think it's not just about the regulator. There's a set of systemic issues that have developed over time that I think drive some perverse behaviours. They create the fear of failure, where in actual fact, if you think about who charities are working with, there's bound to be failures. Yep. Despite your best efforts. You're not always going to gain the success that funders and others expect of you. And from failure, you learn lessons and you improve your services. But if you're in a 3-year funding contract and your organisation is mostly dependent on that, you can't afford to fail. And I think that leads to a lack of transparency, potentially a lack of disclosure when there should be disclosure.
And maybe there's a role therefore for the chair to try and keep pulling the organisation up out of itself and thinking just about the one contract to the next contract to, those different pieces, but for the chair to always remind, I guess, at a mission level, what are we trying to do, and are there some systemic things we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think the chair absolutely has to be the guardian of that, but it's difficult when you're experiencing a funding environment that doesn't operate in such a way. Charities aren't rewarded for their long-term success in making a difference within society. Generally, they're rewarded for meeting short-term targets. And I think there's that culture that's developed through sort of commissioning, but it's also there through grant funding, which it's not working in concert with what boards would like to be doing in terms of thinking about long-term viability.
So one of the things, having as a dilemma,
which I can't offer a sort of solution to that, but I think the more one is able within the sector to understand what some of those systemic issues are, the more you might be making some different decisions. And there is one of the other sort of systemic things I think that's linked to that is this drive for growth. We must grow. And you hear that everywhere. And I always ask the question, well, grow for what purpose? Is it to provide, more people with the benefit of the service that we're providing? Well, that's good, but is that sustainable? Can we do that? Have we got the infrastructure to do that? Have we got the relationships elsewhere to be able to deliver that? And the other difficult funding issue is around innovation, particularly with trust funding. That will fund innovation, great. From that, fund something that you've proven is successful thereafter.
And one of the things we've seen quite a lot of is within that space, particularly when you start to think about restricted and unrestricted funds and how they work, that there is a move from the donors, and particularly the kind of the institutional donors, for more and more restricted funds that make sure that ultimately the end beneficiary gets all of those funds, or it's very project-driven specificity around it, which means you might not be able to pay for some of the things like general safeguarding, security, all of those things that sit within those spaces. And would it be sensible certainly there's a role, I would imagine, for the board and the trustees to ensure that there's a kind of secure minimum for any charity doing what it does, but also maybe for charities to sort of step up and start to say to their donors, we're only going to do this if. Is that right or wrong?
I think there's a role for boards to be more discriminating in terms of the agreements they're getting into, to avoid some of the sort of hazards, traps that I've talked about, which then can bring reputation risk with them when it goes wrong. I think there are some funders who are open to thinking about that and supporting that. I think they're in the minority. Now, my experience of applying for funding is a bit sort of historic now, but what I hear from those who are in the sector is that not a lot's changed, and funding's tighter, and organisations are backing away, I think, from funding things that are riskier. So an organisation I was chair of is having quite difficult times at the moment. They've had some very good support from the family trust fund. And at the time now they need that support the most to bridge across a difficult period. That support has been pulled away because it's too risky. So I think funders need to be reflecting on the level of risk they're prepared to take on. Because if you're only ever funding completely non-risky things, perhaps your funding's not going into the places where it's needed most.
And that comes then to a question almost of risk tolerance, doesn't it? How do you help, I guess, raise the risk tolerance in the right way with the right audiences to being able to do the job you're there to do?
I think the sort of foundation of that is a frank conversation about the fact there are risks here. So, being really clear, not only organisationally, but with those others that you're working with and support, who are perhaps supporting you financially or in other ways, that this is a risky business we're in. So the organisations I've been part of have carried high levels of risk, particularly in relation to safeguarding, working with vulnerable young people. So we understand those risks. We have the right arrangements in place to be able to manage those risks. And a really clear understanding on the board, which again I think is more apparent in housing associations than it is in the voluntary sector, in the charity sector, about what our risk appetite is.
Being explicit about that.
Absolutely explicit. Yeah. So there are some things, safeguarding, where we have zero risk appetite. So we're going to make absolutely sure that that's properly resourced, that we can have all the mechanisms in place to fully understand what's going on there and are able to respond to issues appropriately. There are other things where we have a much greater risk appetite. And I don't think from my experience, there's not enough of those sort of conversations going on explicitly about what risk appetite is. So, and I think it's really important the board has an executive have a common understanding of what that risk appetite is, understand then what mitigations are required in relation to each of those risks. So if something does go wrong, people don't start panicking because you've already understood this could go wrong, and because this is a risky business we're in, despite our best efforts and having done everything right, hopefully, something bad has still happened. We learn from that and we move on.
Yeah. If you were thinking about a chief exec who can see a significant risk around the corner, can see there's a significant reputation risk brewing for the organisation, as a chair, what would your top tip for that chief exec be in relation to managing the board in that situation?
I mean, first is keep me as chair fully informed.
Yeah.
And I think there's a risk if the chair sort of goes off and leaves all the rest of the board behind in relation to these things, because if they feel uninformed, that's just going to that's not going to help at all. So what I've done explicitly in situations is then pick a small group of people from the board based on what their expertise is in relation to the risk. And get the board to give delegated authority to the chair and that small group then to help managing that with the chief exec. So then you're not trying to manage the whole board and some of those who might be more inclined to panic, but the board have got confidence of the chair and people they would respect and trust and understand they've got the right skill sets to be supporting the chief executive team in that.
Because it's quite difficult sometimes, isn't it? Being sort of frank about it. some charity boards, and I already talked about the difficulty recruiting chairs and the difficulty recruiting trustees, actually, especially for a lot of small charities. Some charity boards, just you talk about bringing together a small group with the right skills, but actually they don't have the right skills. And I've seen quite a few situations where actually the chief executive and the executive team have a level of knowledge and skill and experience that is not replicated anywhere on their board of trustees. And therefore, that assurance, that I mean, pretty much they can say what they like, and the board of trustees don't necessarily have the skills to hold them to account for that. And I don't know, maybe I'm being alarmist, but I feel like that's a really common problem in the sector.
Oh, it is completely, and I've seen it. And I think, I mean, in terms of proactively, you have to make sure you've got the right people on the board.
Yeah.
In relation to all the things that you do and are likely to happen as you as an organisation. If there are gaps and then you need outside support, get that outside support.
Yeah.
That might be somebody else in the sector that you know that's just willing to offer free advice. Might be bringing an organisation to help you in relation to those things. But I think and going back to an earlier point, the executive team are the experts we've hired. And we will be looking to them to deliver the expertise that is required. They might not have it because it's a very small organisation or something quite extraordinary has happened, sort of outside the normal sort of remit, then you might need to bring in some additional support. But I think managing a charity board is one of the hardest things I've done.
Really?
Yeah.
Some examples, or what you do? What makes it that hard? I guess.
I mean, one of the things I did successfully was recruit very diverse boards. Because you then get people from a range of experiences and backgrounds who think differently about things. Well, then the thing about trying to achieve a consensus around some things can be quite different. If people are saying the world is very different. So it's quite a skill, I think, in doing that, and requires credibility on the part of the chair and sort of honest and sometimes difficult conversations. And I talked earlier about, at times, the chair stepping up and providing leadership. And I've worked with trustees on boards who are more than happy for that to happen and see that in exceptional circumstances, we can't spend hours trying to reach a consensus on something here. It needs some leadership from the chair or vice chair. There's other trustees who find that very, very difficult. And I'll be left out here and you're not listening to me. And so I've heard that quite a bit. And once you begin to build a board that is far more diverse, and in many places where I was operating has user experience on it as well, that's quite a complex set of dynamics that you're managing. And you don't quite have the authority, well, you don't have the authority at all, the chief exec has, and say, well, actually, I've heard you, just get on and do it. But there's a different style of leadership that's required from that sort of managerial leadership, the chief executive.
And in a risk situation, then, we've talked about this actually with other guests on this podcast about how you kind of balance that leading from the front, the telling, if you like, with the consultation and making sure everybody's heard at a time of risk. For a chair, it sounds like you're saying that's even more difficult because you actually don't have managerial authority.
I think it is more difficult. And I think, I thought a lot about this whilst I was doing it, and I've sort of reflected on it since. And I think the fact that I was a chief executive within the sector and I'm used to making decisions, perhaps when others were telling me that it was the wrong thing to do, but trusting my judgment, equipped me well to be a chair. Now, I had to behave in a completely different way, but I trusted my judgment in a context that I was pretty familiar with and where there wasn't much that was taking me by surprise. Something that might have been really difficult to manage, but it wasn't sort of completely left field. So so that comes down to the sort of, the level of confidence in one's judgment that the chair has, I think. if you don't have that confidence in your own judgment, you're going to really struggle as a chair in those sort of situations. So at times when I almost was going into a sort of chief exec role in terms of leading the board. Like, okay, we're going to do this. I was able to carry that off. And I think that's a consequence of sort of my background, my experience, the fact that people recognised that, I knew what I was doing most of the time.
And I think, that's where, when we see this across actually from the private sector to the public sector to charitable sector as well, behaviours and pressures are really difficult to handle in a crisis situation. And those things have just got faster and faster and faster in terms of the demands for a response. The outside world sits there and has already decided you're probably doing this from a position of being already wrong and motivated to be wrong. And they ascribe you that motivation when most of the organisations we work with, I think if they had been capable of thinking that, it would have been a good thing because operationally they'd have been better at what they did. And so all of those outside demands can be almost entirely unrealistic. And it's how then the executive and the board, and probably just the chair actually more than anything else, and maybe a subcommittee, as you've said earlier, can come together to enable a much faster decision-making process that actually sometimes has to ditch the consensus approach and just be decisive.
Yes, and I think the world you're describing is the world we now live in. It's not a world of we just meet quarterly and we'll just get a report and everything sort of ticks along nicely, is it? Most charities are still operating on that basis. So I think your comments are sort of prompting me to think about how one provides good governance in a way that is more agile. It's still about a consensus because that's what someone's required to do. But some of the practicalities, do our articles and things allow us to behave in these ways? Because sometimes you just get tripped up because you haven't followed your own rules. So I think there's quite a lot of thinking to be done in terms of how one provides good governance in a way that doesn't sort of trash what's good about charity governance, but is able to be a lot more responsive, a lot better at understanding and managing risk. And operating in a world where everybody's now got a platform to say something. Your reputation can go out of the window so quickly as a consequence that something just goes on social media, whether that's accurate or not. And I think quite a lot of us in the sector, or I count myself as this, have come from a different world and are not still fully adjusted in the ways that we work, the ways we think, to a world that is moving at far faster speeds than it used to, even only a decade ago.
And within that space, I think when you're not under pressure, everybody broadly agrees with the statement that charities should be held to higher standards. Because of what you do as a charity, the world and the donors and the individuals who give money and the volunteers who actually give their time as well, actually expect you to behave better than the rest of society. And yet sometimes in those pressure moments, I find we end up having to kind of remind the charities that you are held to higher standards. And that's still a good thing, even when it feels really hard.
I feel other organisations ought to be held to higher standards, quite honestly, when I look at some of the things going on. I think it's absolutely right. There's an expectation that charities do the right thing in the right way for the people that they are there to serve, and that understand that that's what donors and other supporters expect them to be doing. And it's absolutely right if they fall short of that in any way, that there can be criticism, there can be action or whatever. That's fine. You take the consequences, don't you? Things that you don't do well, whether that's intentional or unintentional. So I have no difficulty with those sort of high standards whatsoever. I think the other side of that is that charities need to do more in terms of being transparent about what they're doing. I think charities filter their messages to people, highly filtered messages, perhaps sort of segmented to sort of different stakeholders. And I think there's such a distrust in institutions generally now, isn't there, within society. Charities are getting off fairly light still in relation to that, but people don't understand charities very well. I think if anybody, there's only one group of people who can do something about that, and that's charities themselves. So if you look at propensity to donate, most people aren't donating on the basis of how well a charity is doing in terms of delivering its services. They're donating on the propensity of what percentage of their income do they spend on direct delivery of services. If you go to charity factchecker.net or something, one of those online things, put in the name of a charity, it gives you 4 metrics. There's a dial showing what percentage of money is spent on direct charitable services, how they get that information from, what the chief exec earns, how many volunteers they've got, how many staff they've got. And on the basis of those 4 metrics, they say good, average, below average. There's some big brands that are below average. So if you're thinking of donating, so there's a,
But that takes no account actually of what they do, and therefore how and what's needed.
Yeah.
so, but who else is talking to everybody out there with a propensity to donate in a completely transparent way about what we do, how we do it, and why we need to be spending money on various different things?
Yeah. And as another guest in this podcast said, actually 100% of what charities spend goes on beneficiaries. They're not doing anything, or they shouldn't be doing anything that doesn't help beneficiaries in whatever way that is. You can't do that without a functioning back office. You can't do it without management accountants. You can't do it without HR process. You can't do it without safeguarding, as you rightly said. And so actually those metrics are incredibly reductive, but some boards still do use them to talk about. I've had lots of very difficult conversations with boards about return on investment and what proportion are we spending on back office and what proportion are we spending on salaries and all of this.
Okay, completely. And it's there as part and parcel of all your contracting and funding arrangements as well, isn't it? Everyone wants to know what your overhead cost is. Well, it's not an overhead. We can't do this unless we spend this money. So yeah, I mean, my point is that I think in a world where there is a lack of trust in institutions, charities need to be much, much clearer in their information to the general public and to their donors and supporters. They need to be much quicker, I think, to engage with the regulator in terms of self-disclosure if things aren't going quite right.
Yeah.
Because there's some good examples where that hasn't happened, and that doesn't end well for anybody, does it?
And I do think within all of that then, actually getting to a position where you feel positively confident as both a board and an executive leadership team in the way you manage the entire organisation. So rather than it being administration purely because it's very easy to say, well, we don't want management and we don't want admin costs in an organisation. Yeah. It's a good soundbite, but it's entirely meaningless until you've really thought about what it is. Nobody wants charities that are dealing with children to have no safeguarding funding, because actually that would just be the wrong thing to do. You've got to have the safeguarding funding in the right place. I think positively telling some of those stories to actually reinforce confidently what you're trying to do would be a good thing. But in today's world of risk and where social media can pick up a story and blow it out of proportion, it feels harder to do.
I think it does, but that's a balance of risks, isn't it? Because if you don't tell that story, you're going to end up on the back foot at some stage, and it's too late to dig yourself out of the hole. Yeah. So I take the risk of being open and as transparent as possible. We talk about authenticity in terms of leaders, don't we? I think it's the same with organizations. People need to know they can trust that organization. And one of the ways they know they'll trust that organization is telling a very accurate story in a digestible way about what it's doing and why it's spending money on various things. And talking about the risks that they face, and therefore this is why you need these things in place, is a really important part of that.
And yeah, it would be wrong to have a podcast series where we didn't use the 2 letters AI, so I'm going to go there now. But in a world where AI summaries exist and nobody ends up clicking through to see where the source is and where the information comes from, actually you can end up in places where it is massive misinformation unless you've been actively transparent in really pushing that information out to make sure that the AI is actually looking at the truth rather than what might be made up by somebody about you when people
Backing
don't
from
think
you,
through.
there's going to be no reference to you, is there? So yeah,
So there's an onus on actually
So then
telling
I
a bit
just-
more of your story.
yeah, take control of it. Would be my guidance to people in relation to that. Yeah, and be confident about that. Okay, it might go wrong, but it'll probably go wrong if you don't do it. So
Yeah.
yes, try always be on the front foot.
Thank you.
I think, yeah, that's a really good place to leave it, and that front foot, and I think having enabling leadership and trustees who, I guess, use the word trust there, trust in their leadership and assurance is the right way to go. But Hugh, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got some more things to think about now.
If you're listening and you thought that this was an interesting discussion, please do share on your socials and engage with us at #WhitewaterLeadership. Thank you for joining us, and Polly.
Yeah, thank you from me as well. And do follow me and River Ephra on LinkedIn to get news of all podcast episodes as they drop.